The sound that woke Lieutenant Commander George Washington DeLong on June 11, 1881, was like the world ending. It was the sound of his ship, the USS Jeannette, being torn apart by forces that could crush steel like paper. After 21 months trapped in Arctic ice, their wooden fortress was finally dying, and with it the lives of 33 men might die too. The ship's back broke with a crack like thunder. Arctic seawater poured through gaps that opened faster than they could be plugged. In the howling wind and sub-freezing darkness, DeLong faced every ship captain's nightmare. Abandoned ship in the middle of nowhere, with no hope of rescue and no place to go except onto the ice that had just destroyed their home. For nearly 2 years, the Jeannette had been their world, protecting them from temperatures that could kill in minutes, providing shelter from Arctic storms that could bury them alive, keeping them human while surrounded by a landscape designed to erase all traces of human life. Now, in a matter of hours, 33 men would become castaways on an ice pack hundreds of miles from land, carrying only what they could save from their dying ship. They faced a survival challenge that would test the absolute limits of human endurance, crossing the Arctic wasteland on foot, navigating by stars across moving ice, and somehow finding their way back to civilization before starvation claimed them all. Some would make it, others would die heroes. All of them would prove that when everything depends on refusing to surrender, ordinary people can accomplish things that seem impossible.
Welcome back to Hold On Survival Stories, where we bring you the most incredible tales of human endurance that history tried to bury. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most harrowing Arctic survival stories ever documented. A story of scientific ambition that became a 2-year fight for survival in the most hostile environment on Earth. Before we begin this incredible journey, grab your headphones and prepare yourself for an epic tale of endurance. We're about to travel back to 1879 to witness the USS Jeannette Expedition that began with dreams of reaching the North Pole and ended with men fighting for their lives across hundreds of miles of Arctic wasteland. If you're new to Hold On Survival Stories, we specialize in bringing you the true accounts of ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances and discovered they were capable of far more than they ever imagined. These aren't Hollywood fantasies. These are real people who lived through experiences that will challenge everything you think you know about human limits. Today's story takes us aboard a U.S. Navy ship that became trapped in Arctic ice for nearly 2 years, forcing her crew to abandon ship and undertake one of the most desperate survival journeys in polar exploration history. It's a story of leadership under impossible pressure, of scientific expedition turned into fight for survival, and of men who proved that human determination can overcome even the most brutal forces of nature. So settle in, because what you're about to hear is the story of the USS Jeannette Expedition and the men who refused to surrender to the ice that tried to claim their lives.
In 1879, the race to reach the North Pole captured the imagination of the civilized world like a fever. Nations competed to plant their flags at the top of the world, while newspaper readers followed every expedition with the passion normally reserved for sporting events. It was into this atmosphere of international competition and national pride that Lieutenant Commander George Washington DeLong received the command that would define his life and determine his fate. The USS Jeannette was purchased by James Gordon Bennett, Jr., the wealthy publisher of the New York Herald, and donated to the U.S. Navy specifically for a polar expedition. Bennett had previously funded Henry Morton Stanley's famous search for Dr. Livingstone in Africa, and he saw Arctic exploration as another opportunity to capture public attention while advancing American prestige. DeLong was 35 years old when he received command of the Jeannette, a career naval officer with Arctic experience but burning ambition to make his mark in polar exploration. He believed that reaching the North Pole would establish him among the great explorers of his age, while failure would mean obscurity and professional disappointment. The ship herself was a 142-foot steam bark, specially reinforced for ice navigation, but still fundamentally a wooden vessel, vulnerable to the crushing forces that Arctic ice could generate. Her steam engine provided power for breaking through ice, while her reinforced hull was designed to withstand pressure that would destroy ordinary ships. The expedition's scientific mission was ambitious and comprehensive. Besides attempting to reach the North Pole, they planned to conduct meteorological observations, map unknown Arctic territories, and advance understanding of polar climate and geography. The crew included not just sailors, but scientists, cartographers, and researchers who expected to make important discoveries. DeLong assembled a crew of 33 men who represented some of the most experienced Arctic sailors and scientists available. Among them were men who had sailed with previous polar expeditions, engineers who understood the specialized equipment necessary for Arctic survival, and researchers whose expertise would be crucial for the mission's scientific objectives. On July 8, 1879, the Jeannette departed from San Francisco amid fanfare and public celebration. Newspapers covered their departure as a historic moment in American exploration, while the crew carried with them the hopes and expectations of a nation that saw Arctic exploration as a test of national character and capability. The early stages of their journey proceeded according to plan, as they sailed north through the Bering Strait and into the Arctic Ocean. Ice conditions were manageable, and the crew was optimistic about their prospects for reaching high latitudes and possibly even the North Pole itself. But the Arctic Ocean had its own plans for the Jeannette Expedition. By September 1879, just 2 months after their departure, the ship became trapped in pack ice near the New Siberian Islands, approximately 150 miles north of the Siberian coast. What the crew expected to be a temporary delay became a permanent imprisonment as the ice consolidated around their ship. The ice pack that held the Jeannette was not the stable platform that many expedition members had expected. Driven by winds and currents, it moved constantly, carrying the ship in directions that bore no relationship to their intended course. They became passengers on a frozen ocean that could deliver them anywhere or destroy them without warning. As autumn turned to winter, temperatures dropped to levels that challenged both the ship's systems and the crew's endurance. The Arctic night settled over them like a living thing, bringing months of darkness that tested their psychological resilience and their ability to maintain hope when their situation seemed increasingly hopeless. DeLong maintained strict naval discipline and routine as the only way to preserve morale and order during their involuntary imprisonment. Daily watches, equipment maintenance, and scientific observations continued, even though their original mission had become impossible to fulfill. The ship's heating systems struggled against Arctic temperatures that regularly dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Keeping the vessel habitable required constant attention to coal consumption, ventilation, and the prevention of dangerous carbon monoxide buildup that could kill the entire crew. Food supplies, originally calculated for a specific expedition timeline, had to be rationed as it became clear that their ice imprisonment might continue indefinitely. Fresh food disappeared first, leading to scurvy and other diseases that weakened the crew's ability to handle emergency situations. By the spring of 1880, after nearly 8 months trapped in ice, the crew began to understand that their situation was not temporary, but potentially permanent. The ice showed no signs of releasing their ship, and they faced the possibility of spending years imprisoned in the Arctic or dying when their supplies were exhausted. DeLong began planning for the possibility that the ship might be destroyed by ice pressure, and that the crew would be forced to abandon their vessel and attempt to reach safety on foot. This contingency planning would prove crucial when the Arctic finally revealed its ultimate power over human ambition and technological confidence. As their second winter in the ice approached, the 33 men aboard the Jeannette faced the knowledge that they had become prisoners of the Arctic, dependent entirely on their ship's ability to withstand crushing ice pressure and their own ability to endure isolation, cold, and uncertainty that tested every aspect of their physical and mental endurance.
For 21 months, the USS Jeannette had been locked in Arctic ice that moved with the whims of wind and current, carrying the ship and her 33-man crew hundreds of miles from their intended course. The vessel had become both shelter and prison, protecting them from the Arctic environment while trapping them in a slowly moving ice pack that could destroy them at any moment. By June 1881, the ice pressure that had held the ship captive for nearly 2 years began to intensify beyond anything the crew had previously experienced. The sounds of grinding ice and creaking timber became constant and ominous, warning everyone aboard that their wooden fortress was losing its battle against forces that could crush steel. Lieutenant Commander DeLong had used their months of imprisonment to prepare for the ship's eventual destruction. Supplies were organized and cached, survival equipment was assembled, and every man knew his role in abandoning ship. But preparing for disaster and actually facing it were entirely different challenges. The Jeannette's hull had been specially reinforced for Arctic navigation, but no wooden ship could withstand indefinite pressure from moving ice floes that generated thousands of tons of crushing force. The sound of splintering wood and bending metal became the soundtrack of their final days aboard the vessel that had been their home for 2 years. On June 11, 1881, the inevitable happened. A massive pressure ridge formed directly beneath the Jeannette, lifting her hull and twisting her frame beyond the breaking point. The ship's back broke with a sound like thunder, and Arctic seawater began pouring into her hold through cracks that opened faster than they could be plugged. The abandoned ship order came at 4 a.m., rousing the crew from their bunks to face the crisis they had been preparing for since their imprisonment began. In sub-freezing temperatures and howling wind, 33 men had to evacuate everything necessary for survival from a ship that was rapidly filling with water and ice. The evacuation was both frantic and methodical. DeLong's months of preparation paid off as supplies, equipment, and provisions were moved from the dying ship to the ice with efficiency that saved crucial minutes and potentially lives. But the Arctic conditions made every trip between ship and ice dangerous and exhausting.
Essential supplies included food for an unknown survival period, navigation instruments, medical supplies, weapons for hunting, tools for building shelter, and the 3 ship's boats that represented their only hope for eventual escape from the ice. Every item saved could mean the difference between survival and death for the entire crew. The sled dogs that had been brought for polar exploration became crucial for survival as the crew prepared to cross hundreds of miles of ice and open water to reach the Siberian mainland. These animals would provide transportation, labor, and potentially emergency food if starvation became extreme. Personal belongings had to be abandoned as survival took priority over sentiment. Years of personal effects, scientific equipment, and individual treasures disappeared into the Arctic Ocean along with the ship that had been their world for nearly 2 years. The destruction of the Jeannette was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The ship had been their protection from the Arctic, their connection to civilization, and their hope for eventual return home. With her death, they became castaways on an ice pack hundreds of miles from land, with no realistic hope of rescue. DeLong's leadership during these crucial hours established the tone for the survival ordeal that followed. He maintained order and purpose while organizing the complex task of moving everything necessary for 33 men to survive indefinitely in Arctic conditions. His naval training and natural authority kept the crew functioning as a unit when panic could have been fatal. The camp they established on the ice near their sunken ship was a temporary base that had to be abandoned as ice conditions changed. They were living on a platform that could break apart, move in any direction, or be crushed by pressure ridges without warning. Stability was an illusion in an environment where nothing was permanent except the cold. Food rationing became immediate and critical as DeLong calculated their supplies against unknown survival time. The provisions saved from the ship would sustain 33 men for a limited period, but beyond that, they would depend on hunting Arctic wildlife or reaching civilization before starvation claimed them. Navigation became essential for any hope of eventual rescue or escape. DeLong used his instruments and experience to track their position as the ice carried them in directions they could not control. Understanding where they were and where they were going was crucial for planning their eventual attempt to reach safety. The psychological impact of losing their ship was profound and lasting. The crew had to adapt from being sailors aboard a vessel to Arctic castaways whose survival depended on their ability to live and travel on ice. Everything familiar about their lives had been stripped away, leaving only the basic struggle to stay alive. Medical problems began to emerge as the stress of their situation combined with the effects of months of inadequate diet and Arctic conditions. Scurvy, frostbite, and other cold-related illnesses weakened men who needed maximum strength for the challenges ahead. The 3 ships' boats that they had saved represented their only realistic hope for eventual escape from the ice. These boats would have to carry them across open water when they reached the edge of the ice pack, but they also had to be transported across hundreds of miles of rough ice before they could be launched. As summer progressed and the ice began to show signs of breaking up, DeLong faced the crucial decision of when to abandon their ice camp and begin the desperate journey toward land. Timing would be critical. Too early, and they would face impossible ice conditions. Too late, and they would be trapped for another Arctic winter with depleted supplies. The 33 survivors of the Jeannette prepared for what would become one of the most challenging survival journeys in Arctic exploration history, knowing that their chances of reaching safety were slim, but that remaining on the ice meant certain death when their food ran out.
On July 17, 1881, Lieutenant Commander DeLong made the decision that would determine the fate of his 33 men, They would abandon their ice camp and begin the desperate journey across the pack ice toward the Siberian mainland, 400 miles to the south. It was a decision that meant leaving the relative safety of their established camp for the unknown dangers of Arctic travel, with no guarantee they would ever reach land. The logistics of moving 33 men and their essential supplies across the Arctic ice were staggering. They had 3 ship's boats that had to be transported across rough ice until they reached open water, along with food, equipment, weapons, and medical supplies that could mean the difference between survival and death. The sleds that would carry their boats and supplies had been improvised from ship's materials and reinforced for the brutal conditions they would face. Each sled carried hundreds of pounds of equipment, requiring multiple men to pull it across ice that could be rough, soft, or dangerously unstable. The physical demands of Arctic travel pushed every man to his limits from the first day. Pulling heavy sleds across rough ice for 12 to 15 hours per day required strength and endurance that few of the crew possessed. The soft snow and unstable ice made every step exhausting, while the constant cold drained energy and reduced efficiency. Navigation across the moving ice pack required constant vigilance and expert knowledge that only DeLong possessed. The ice was drifting with currents and winds that could carry them away from their intended course, while pressure ridges and open leads constantly changed the terrain they had to cross. The ice was a living, moving maze that constantly changed and threatened to trap them. Food rationing became even more critical during the march as the physical demands of travel increased their caloric needs while their supplies remained fixed. DeLong calculated rations that would keep the men alive but could not provide adequate nutrition for the energy they were expending. The sled dogs that had been essential for pulling loads began dying from exhaustion, inadequate food, and the extreme conditions. Each dead dog represented not just lost transportation, but also potential emergency food that might keep the men alive if starvation became extreme. Weather conditions during the march were brutal and unpredictable. Blizzards could trap them for days in makeshift shelters, while sudden temperature changes could make ice conditions dangerous or impassable. Every day of delay consumed precious food while making their ultimate survival less likely. Equipment failures became more frequent and more dangerous as their journey continued. Sleds broke under the stress of rough ice, while essential tools were lost when ice gave way unexpectedly. Every equipment failure reduced their chances of reaching safety and increased the physical demands on men who were already weakening from malnutrition. The psychological pressure of the march was enormous for everyone involved. They were traveling toward a destination they might never reach, consuming supplies that would eventually run out, and facing daily challenges that could kill them individually or collectively. Maintaining hope and discipline required constant effort from leaders and men alike. Sleep became a luxury that had to be carefully balanced against the need to keep moving. Their tent accommodations were inadequate for 33 men, meaning that rest was always uncomfortable and often dangerous in the extreme cold. But traveling without adequate rest led to accidents and poor decision-making that could be fatal. The ice conditions they encountered challenged every assumption about Arctic travel. Pressure ridges created mountain-like obstacles that required enormous effort to cross, while leads of open water forced dangerous detours that could add days to their journey. The ice was a living, moving maze that constantly changed and threatened to trap them. Medical emergencies began to occur as the stress of Arctic travel combined with malnutrition and cold exposure. Men suffered frostbite, snow blindness, and exhaustion that made them liabilities rather than assets for group survival. Caring for sick and injured men added to the burden of an already impossible journey. Group dynamics began to show strain as hunger, exhaustion, and fear affected everyone's judgment and emotional control. Arguments broke out over pace, route selection, and resource allocation, threatening the cooperation that was essential for group survival. After weeks of brutal travel across the ice, they finally reached the edge of the pack and the beginning of open water. But this transition from ice travel to ocean voyage presented new challenges that would test their different aspects of their survival skills and endurance. The 3 boats they had transported across hundreds of miles of ice would now have to carry them across dangerous Arctic waters to reach the Siberian coast. These boats, damaged by their overland journey and loaded beyond their design capacity, represented their final hope for reaching safety. DeLong made the crucial decision to split his company into 3 groups, each traveling in one of the boats. This decision distributed the risk, but also meant that the groups might become separated, with some reaching safety while others perished. It was a calculated gamble that reflected the desperate nature of their situation. The launch of the 3 boats marked the end of their ice ordeal and the beginning of a maritime survival challenge that would test their seamanship and endurance in different but equally dangerous ways. They had survived the ice march, but their ordeal was far from over. As the 3 boats disappeared into the Arctic Ocean, carrying 33 men toward an uncertain fate, they represented one of the most desperate rescue attempts in exploration history. Men trying to save themselves when no outside help was possible, and survival depended entirely on their own skills and determination.
On September 12, 1881, the 3 boats carrying the Jeannette survivors launched into the frigid waters of the Arctic Ocean, beginning the final phase of their survival journey. Lieutenant Commander DeLong commanded the first cutter with 14 men. Chief Engineer George Melville led the second cutter with 11 men, and Master John Dannenhauer took the whaleboat with 8 men. What happened next would determine who lived and who died in one of the most dramatic survival stories in polar exploration history. The boats were overcrowded, damaged from their transport across the ice, and loaded beyond their safe capacity with men, supplies, and equipment. They rode dangerously low in the water, making them vulnerable to being swamped by waves that wouldn't threaten properly loaded vessels. Every boat was a survival gamble in waters where mistakes meant death. Weather conditions in the Arctic Ocean were hostile and unpredictable. Storm systems could generate waves large enough to overwhelm their small boats, while sudden changes in wind direction could drive them away from land toward the open polar sea. Navigation in these conditions required skill and luck in equal measure. The 3 boats managed to stay together for the first few days of their ocean voyage, but deteriorating weather and the different sailing characteristics of their damaged vessels gradually separated them. By September 17th, they had lost sight of each other in the vast Arctic Ocean, and each boat faced the challenge of reaching safety independently. Master Dannenhauer's whaleboat was the first to reach the Siberian coast, landing near the Lena River Delta after a harrowing voyage through storm-tossed seas. The 8 men in his boat were in desperate condition, severely weakened by months of survival, injured from their ordeal, and barely able to function as a crew. The Lena Delta was a vast, swampy wilderness that offered some shelter from Arctic storms but presented new challenges for survival. The area was virtually uninhabited, with scattered native settlements that might provide help or might view the castaways as threats.
Navigation through the delta's maze of channels and islands required local knowledge that none of the Americans possessed. Danenhauer's group managed to make contact with native peoples who provided food, shelter, and guidance that probably saved their lives. The Russians and indigenous peoples of the region understood Arctic survival in ways that the American explorers could not match, and their assistance was crucial for the survivors' eventual rescue. Chief Engineer Melville's boat faced different challenges as they approached the Siberian coast through increasingly dangerous weather. Storm conditions and equipment failures tested their seamanship to their limits, but Melville's technical expertise and leadership kept their men functioning as a crew when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm them. Melville's group also reached the Lena Delta, but at a different location from Danenhauer's boat. They too encountered native peoples who provided assistance, but their landing was more difficult and dangerous, with several men injured during the treacherous approach to shore through rough seas and shallow water. The reunification of Danenhauer's and Melville's groups provided mutual support and increased their chances of survival, but it also raised agonizing questions about the fate of DeLong's boat, which had vanished without trace during the storm that separated them. Lieutenant Commander DeLong's boat, carrying 14 men, including himself, faced the worst conditions and the most tragic fate. Storm damage to their boat made sailing increasingly difficult and dangerous, while their course took them toward a more desolate section of the Siberian coast that offered fewer resources for survival. DeLong's group managed to reach shore, but landed in an area where finding food, shelter, and assistance was nearly impossible. The delta region where they landed was virtually uninhabited, with harsh conditions that challenged their survival skills beyond their already stretched limits. The 14 men under DeLong's command faced starvation, exposure, and medical emergencies that gradually reduced their numbers as the strongest men tried to care for the weakest. Their detailed journals, maintained even as they were dying, provide heartbreaking documentation of their final weeks. DeLong himself survived longer than most of his men, maintaining his command responsibilities and caring for his crew even as he weakened from starvation and cold. His final journal entries reveal a leader who never stopped trying to save his men, even when his own death became certain. Of the 14 men in DeLong's boat, only 2 survived, the expedition's Chinese cook and 1 sailor who were found by native hunters months after the others had died. Their survival was due partly to luck, but mostly to their determination to keep moving when their companions could no longer continue. The discovery of DeLong's camp and the recovery of his journals provided crucial information about the final weeks of their survival attempt. The detailed records revealed the gradual deterioration of the men and the heroic efforts of their commander to save lives even when salvation seemed impossible. Melville organized search parties that eventually located DeLong's camp and recovered the bodies of the expedition leader and his men. The discovery provided closure for families, but also revealed the tragic cost of their Arctic ordeal and the heroic leadership that had characterized their final weeks. The fate of the 3 boats demonstrated both the power of leadership and the role of chance in survival situations. Skill and determination had brought 2 boats to safety, but weather, navigation, and landing conditions had determined that the 3rd boat's crew would not survive their ordeal. The survivors who reached safety carried with them detailed knowledge of one of the most challenging survival experiences ever documented. Their accounts provided valuable information about Arctic travel, survival psychology, and the effects of prolonged stress on human performance and decision-making. The rescue of the survivors required international cooperation between American, Russian, and native peoples who worked together to provide assistance and transportation.
The complexity of the rescue operation reflected the remote location and difficult conditions that had made the original expedition so dangerous. News of the Jeannette disaster and the survival of some crew members created international attention and controversy about the wisdom and planning of polar expeditions. The tragedy raised questions about the human and financial costs of Arctic exploration, while also celebrating the remarkable endurance of those who had survived. The scientific knowledge gained from the expedition was substantial, despite its tragic outcome. The meteorological and geographical observations made during their ice imprisonment provided valuable data about Arctic conditions, while their survival experience contributed to understanding of human adaptation to extreme environments. As the survivors began their long journey back to civilization, they carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the ultimate test of human endurance, and that some had passed while others had paid the ultimate price. Their ordeal had lasted over 2 years and had tested every aspect of physical strength, mental resilience, and leadership under impossible circumstances.
The survivors of the USS Jeannette Expedition returned to civilization in 1882 as living legends who had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had survived over 2 years in the Arctic, including months of imprisonment in ice, a desperate march across frozen wasteland, and a dangerous ocean voyage in damaged boats. Chief Engineer George Melville emerged as the expedition's greatest hero, not just for his own survival, but for his leadership in organizing rescue efforts for other survivors and his tireless work to locate and recover the bodies of Lieutenant Commander DeLong and his men. Melville's technical expertise and determination had saved multiple lives and provided closure for grieving families. Master John Danauer's survival, with his entire boat crew, demonstrated the importance of seamanship and leadership under extreme pressure. His ability to navigate through Arctic storms and make contact with native peoples who could provide assistance had been crucial for the survival of 8 men who might otherwise have died on the Siberian coast. The 2 survivors from DeLong's boat, Louis Noros and Nindemann the cook, represented the ultimate test of individual endurance and determination. Their survival, when 12 of their companions died, revealed the role of both physical resilience and psychological strength in extreme survival situations. The psychological effects of their ordeal were profound and lasting for all survivors. They had witnessed the deaths of shipmates, endured starvation and exposure that pushed human limits, and experienced isolation and uncertainty that challenged their fundamental beliefs about survival and mortality. Medical examination of the survivors revealed the extent of their physical adaptation to extreme conditions. Weight loss, cold injuries, and nutritional deficiencies had marked them permanently, but they had also demonstrated the human body's remarkable ability to adapt to circumstances that should have been fatal. The detailed journals and records maintained by expedition members throughout their ordeal provided unprecedented documentation of long-term survival under extreme conditions. These records became invaluable for researchers studying human adaptation, survival psychology, and the effects of prolonged stress on group dynamics. The controversy surrounding the expedition's planning and leadership became subjects of intense debate in naval and exploration circles. Questions were raised about whether the mission had been adequately prepared for Arctic conditions and whether different decisions might have prevented some of the casualties. The scientific results of the expedition were substantial despite its tragic human cost. Meteorological observations, geographical discoveries, and oceanographic data collected during their ice imprisonment contributed significantly to understanding of Arctic conditions and climate patterns. Lieutenant Commander DeLong's reputation evolved from expedition leader to martyred hero whose final weeks demonstrated extraordinary leadership under impossible circumstances. His journals revealed a commander who never stopped trying to save his men even when his own death became certain. The technological lessons learned from the Jeannette's destruction influenced future ship design and Arctic exploration planning. The failure of even a specially reinforced vessel to withstand ice pressure led to improved understanding of the forces involved in polar navigation and better preparation for ice imprisonment. International cooperation in the rescue operation set precedents for future polar emergencies and demonstrated the importance of diplomatic relations in organizing complex rescue missions in remote areas. The American, Russian, and native cooperation that had saved lives became a model for subsequent operations. The survivors became advocates for improved Arctic exploration safety and more realistic planning for polar expeditions. Their experience provided practical knowledge about survival equipment, food requirements, and group organization that influenced future expeditions. Public interest in the Jeannette story contributed to broader understanding of Arctic exploration and its challenges. The expedition's tragedy and triumph captured popular imagination while educating people about the realities of polar exploration and the costs of pushing human limits in extreme environments. The families of those who died received recognition and compensation, but the loss of 20 lives remained a tragic aspect of the story that overshadowed the remarkable survival of the others. The expedition demonstrated both the incredible resilience of human beings and the terrible costs of exploring Earth's most hostile environments. Literary and artistic works inspired by the Jeannette Expedition helped preserve the story for future generations while exploring its themes of leadership, sacrifice, and human endurance. The expedition became part of exploration literature and a symbol of both human ambition and human resilience. Modern analysis of the expedition, using contemporary survival and leadership theory, has provided new insights into the factors that determined who survived and who died. The role of leadership, group dynamics, and individual resilience in extreme survival situations continues to be studied by researchers and military organizations. The Jeannette survivors proved that human beings can endure circumstances that exceed normal expectations of survival, but they also demonstrated the importance of preparation, leadership, and cooperation in extreme situations. Their story serves as both inspiration and warning for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges. The expedition's legacy includes both the scientific knowledge gained and the human stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival that continue to inspire people facing their own challenges. The survivors showed that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when their determination to live exceeds every obstacle that fate places in their path. Most importantly, the Jeannette Expedition demonstrated that survival is often determined not by individual heroism, but by leadership that preserves group cohesion and cooperation when everything depends on people working together against impossible odds. The survivors lived because they never stopped caring for each other, even when caring seemed hopeless.
The aftermath of the USS Jeannette Expedition forced the American public and the international exploration community to confront uncomfortable truths about the human cost of polar exploration and the thin line between heroic achievement and tragic disaster. The expedition had begun with dreams of national glory and scientific discovery, but had ended with 20 dead and survivors who carried permanent scars from their Arctic ordeal. The official investigation into the expedition's failure and casualties revealed both the remarkable heroism of the survivors and the systematic problems that had contributed to the disaster. Poor planning for ice imprisonment, inadequate food reserves, and unrealistic expectations about Arctic conditions had created a survival situation that tested human limits beyond reasonable endurance. Chief Engineer Melville's testimony about the final weeks of DeLong's group provided heartbreaking details about men who had died slowly from starvation and cold while maintaining their humanity and concern for each other. His efforts to locate and recover their bodies demonstrated loyalty and leadership that extended beyond survival into honor for the dead. The scientific data collected during the expedition's 2 years of ice imprisonment proved valuable despite the human cost of obtaining it. Meteorological observations, ice movement tracking, and geographical discoveries contributed to understanding of Arctic conditions that would benefit future expeditions and research. But the knowledge gained came at a price that raised questions about whether any scientific discovery justified the loss of 20 lives. The expedition's tragedy sparked debates about exploration ethics and the responsibility of leaders and sponsors for the safety of expedition members. The survivors' accounts of their ordeal provided insights into human behavior under extreme stress that influenced military training, emergency response planning, and survival education. Their experience became a case study in leadership, group dynamics, and individual resilience that continued to be analyzed decades later. The psychological effects of their survival experience affected the survivors for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, while others found that their Arctic experience had given them perspectives and capabilities that influenced their subsequent careers and personal lives. Public reaction to the Jeannette story was complex and reflected broader attitudes about exploration, heroism, and national prestige. While the survivors were celebrated as heroes, questions were also raised about the wisdom of risking lives for geographical discoveries that might have limited practical value. The financial cost of the expedition and the subsequent rescue operations was enormous, requiring government funding and private contributions that raised questions about resource allocation and the relative importance of exploration versus other national priorities. International relations were both strengthened and complicated by the rescue operations that had required cooperation between American, Russian, and Native peoples. The diplomatic aspects of organizing rescue missions in foreign territories created precedents for future international emergency cooperation. The technological lessons learned from the expedition influenced ship design, survival equipment, and navigation techniques for future polar expeditions. The failure of conventional approaches to Arctic travel led to innovations that improved safety and effectiveness for subsequent explorers. The literary and artistic legacy of the Jeannette Expedition contributed to popular understanding of Arctic exploration and its challenges. Books, articles, and artistic works helped preserve the story while exploring its themes of leadership, sacrifice, and human endurance under impossible circumstances. Educational institutions used the Jeannette story to teach navigation, leadership, and crisis management, while the expedition's scientific results contributed to academic understanding of polar geography and climate. The tragedy became a learning experience that influenced multiple fields of study. The families of the dead received recognition and compensation, but no amount of money could replace the husbands, fathers, and sons who had died in the Arctic ice. The human cost of exploration remained a permanent reminder of the price paid for advancing geographical knowledge. Memorial services and monuments honored both the dead and the survivors, creating lasting recognition of their sacrifice and achievement. The Jeannette Expedition became part of American naval history and a symbol of courage and determination in the face of impossible odds.
The debate over polar exploration's value and cost continued for decades after the Jeannette disaster, influencing government policy and public support for subsequent expeditions. The tragedy raised fundamental questions about the wisdom of risking lives for discoveries that might have limited practical benefit. Modern historians and exploration experts continue to analyze the Jeannette expedition for lessons about leadership, survival, and the human cost of exploration. The story remains relevant for contemporary discussions about risk, leadership, and the balance between achievement and safety. The survivors who returned from the Arctic carried with them not just the memory of their ordeal, but the knowledge that they had faced the ultimate test of human endurance and had proven that some people could survive circumstances that killed others. Their survival was both personal triumph and lasting testament to human resilience. The USS Jeannette Expedition stands as one of the most complex and tragic stories in exploration history, a tale of scientific ambition that became a survival epic, of leadership that saved some lives while being unable to save others, and of human beings who discovered the ultimate boundaries of endurance when everything depended on refusing to surrender to death. Their legacy includes both the scientific knowledge they gained and the human stories of courage and survival that continue to inspire people facing their own impossible challenges. The USS Jeannette survivors proved that with proper leadership and unwavering determination, some people can survive even when survival seems impossible.
And that's the incredible story of the USS Jeannette Expedition survivors. Men who turned scientific exploration into one of the most harrowing survival stories in Arctic history. What strikes me most about this story is how it shows both the triumph and the tragedy of human exploration. Here were men who set out to plant the American flag at the North Pole and instead found themselves fighting for their lives for over 2 years in conditions that would test the absolute limits of human endurance. 20 men died during this expedition, including Lieutenant Commander DeLong, who maintained his leadership and kept detailed journals right up until his death from starvation in the Siberian wilderness. But 13 men survived, and their survival depended on extraordinary leadership, incredible teamwork, and the absolute refusal to give up when everything seemed hopeless. Think about what these men endured. Nearly 2 years trapped in a ship that was slowly being crushed by Arctic ice. Then a desperate march across hundreds of miles of frozen wasteland, followed by a dangerous ocean voyage in damaged boats. Each phase of their ordeal should have killed them, but they kept finding ways to adapt, to survive, to hold on. Chief Engineer George Melville became the real hero of this story, not just surviving himself, but organizing rescue operations for other survivors and never giving up the search for DeLong's lost group. That's the kind of leadership that saves lives and honors the dead. What really gets me is how this story shows how survival often comes down to the choices leaders make under impossible pressure. DeLong's decision to split into 3 boats probably saved some lives, even though it meant others would die alone. These were decisions no one should have to make, but leaders sometimes face impossible choices. The Jeannette survivors proved that human beings can adapt to circumstances that seemed designed to kill them. They survived on starvation rations. They learned to navigate by stars across moving ice. They maintained hope when hope seemed absurd. They showed that the human capacity for endurance goes far beyond what most of us will ever discover about ourselves. But their story is also a reminder that survival can come at terrible costs. The knowledge they gained, the heroism they displayed, the limits they transcended, all of this came at the price of 20 lives and permanent scars for those who lived. Real survival isn't a Hollywood adventure. It's often about choosing who lives and who dies when there aren't enough resources for everyone. So here's my question for you. What leadership challenges are you facing that require impossible decisions? What situations in your life demand the kind of determination the Jeannette survivor showed when giving up seemed like the only rational choice? Before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. What part of the Jeannette story inspired you most? Have you ever been in a situation where strong leadership made the difference between disaster and survival? And what survival story would you like me to cover next? If the incredible journey of the Jeannette survivors kept you engaged, please hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these amazing stories of human resilience and leadership under pressure. And make sure you're subscribed to Hold On, Survival Stories with notifications turned on. Coming up, we have more incredible survival stories that will challenge everything you think you know about human limits. People who faced death for months or years and found ways through, who proved that the human spirit can triumph over even the most impossible circumstances. Until next time, remember the lesson of the Jeannette survivors. When you're facing impossible odds, when your resources are running out, when people are depending on your leadership, that's when you discover what you're really made of. Sometimes survival requires making decisions that seem impossible, but refusing to make them means everyone dies. This has been Hold On, Survival Stories. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey of Arctic survival, leadership, and the ultimate test of human endurance. And I'll see you in the next one.